Good evening and welcome to Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the stories of remarkable lives. Before we begin, if soothing history helps you unwind, please like and subscribe. It makes a big difference in helping other sleepless souls find our channel. Oh, and which remarkable figure would you like us to tackle next? Let us know in the comments. Tonight, we explore the life of Vladimir Lenin, a revolutionary who shaped the 20th century. He was the architect of a new Russia, leading a movement that overturned empires and defined an era. But who was Vladimir Lenin before he changed the world? How did his early years shape the man he became? And what drove him from quiet student to revolutionary? Together, we'll journey through Lenin's life. From his childhood on the banks of the Volga to secret meetings in St. Petersburg apartments and Finalito, the very heart of revolution itself. So, just relax and let your mind drift us. We explore the remarkable life of Vladimir Lenin. Chapter 1: An Inheritance of Fire. The story begins in 1870 in the provincial town of Simbursk. Perched on the western bank of the Vola River, picture a place where wooden houses lean into muddy streets, where church bells mark the hours, and where the mighty river flows past with all the patience of eternity. Here, in a modest but respectable home, Ilya Ulanov paces Thefla, waiting for his fourth child, Tobe, born. Outside, April snow melts into Thebla earth of Russia. Inside, Mary Alexandra labors to bring new life into a world that seems frozen in time. When the baby finally arrives, a boy healthy and loud, Ilya permits himself a moment of pure joy before returning to his papers. There's always more work Tobe done. They name him Vladimir. Nobody in that room, not Thieg's housed mother, not the proud father, not the midwife washing her hands in Thekina, could imagine what this culling infant would become. How could they? History doesn't announce itself with trumpets. It arrives in theodinary moments disguised as everyday. Ilya Lonov was a man caught between worlds. The son of a serf who'd earned his freedom. He'd climbed the ranks of the imperial education system through sheer determination and an almost religious faith in the power of learning. By the time Vladimir was born, Ilya had become an inspector of schools for the entire Simsk province, a position that put him firmly in the ranks of the minor nobility. Think about that for a moment. A former serf's son teaching the emperor's children. It was the kind of success story that Alexander I's reforms had promised to make possible. The Tsar Liberator had freed the serfs in 1861, just 9 years before Vladimir's birth. Russia was changing, or at least. But change in Russia has always been a dangerous business. The ground beneath your feet might look solid, but there are always cracks forming. Always pressures building beneath the surface. Ilya felt those pressures every day as he traveled from village to village, trying to build schools where none had existed, trying to light candles of literacy in the vast darkness of rural life. The Ulanov household hummed with a peculiar energy. It was a home of books and debates, of piano lessons and chess games, where German was spoken alongside Russian, where Orthodox traditions mixed within. Maria Alexandra, born Maria Blank, brought her own complexity to the daughter of a doctor with German roots. She carried whispers of Jewish ancestry that the family never quite acknowledged out loud. Vladimir grew up in this swirl of identities, and the third son with his distinctive features, high cheekbones, slightly slanted eyes that some attributed to possible comic ancestry in his father's side, though this is not certain. Russia itself was written on his face. That vast empire where European and Asian bloodlines had been mixing for centuries. The house filled with Anna, the eldest, serious and studious. Alexander, Sasha, Tethefamily, brilliant and brooding. Vladimir, quick and competitive. Then Olga, Dmitri, and finally 6 children climbing over each other, arguing over toys and books, while their father worked late into the night, planning new schools for peasant children who'd never held a pen. Ilya believed in progress the way. Some men believe in God. He'd seen what education could do. It had lifted him from nothing to something. Every school he opened was a small revolution, a tiny crack in the ancient walls of Russian backwardness. He worked himself to Shoshustian, traveling in all weather, battling bureaucracy and local coming home with muddy boots and stories of villages where children learned their letters by candlelight. But by the late 1870s, the wind was changing. Alexander I, the Tsar who'd freed the serfs, was growing nervous. Revolutionary groups were sprouting like mushrooms after rain. Young people with wild eyes and frame books talked about In March of 1881, when Vladimir was not quite 11, a bump thrown by revolutionaries finally found its mark. The Tsar Liberator died in a St. Petersburg street, his leg shattered, his reforms dying with him. Alexander III came to the throne with a simple message: enough, enough reform, enough progress. Enough dangerous ideas. The new Tsar believed in orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. The old triple formula of Russian power. Schools that taught peasants to Wecker, suddenly viewed with suspicion. Inspectors like Ilya Ulanov found their work increasingly difficult, their ideals increasingly dangerous. Vladimir watched his father grow grayer, more tired, more frustrated. The schools Ilya had worked so hard to build were strangled by new regulations, new restrictions. Progress, it seemed, had been a temporary illusion. The empire was tightening its fist again, squeezing out the spaces where hope had breathed. Yet, in that comfortable house in Simbi, with its piano and its books and its 6 bright children, life went in. Vladimir played chess with frightening intensity, demolishing his siblings with a focus that bordered on cruelty. He swam in the Volga daring brief, blazing summers. He absorbs his father's faith in education and his mother's quiet strength. He was preparing for something, though hadn't know what. History was gathering itself in Thut House by the river. In the tensions between old and new, between hope and reaction, between a father's dreams of gradual progress and the darker currents flowing through the empire. The fuse was being lit, though nobody could see Theflam yet. Not even the boy who would one day set the world on fire. Chapter 2. The Brother Shows. January 1886. Vladimir was 15, home from gymnasium for the winter holidays. The house smelled of beeswax and boiled cabbage. Outside, Simbirsk lay buried under 3 feet of snow. Inside, something was wrong with some. Alexander Ulanov had always been the quiet one, the brilliant one. Theon, who could lose himself for hours in a book about earthworms or chemical reactions. Now home from St. Petersburg University, he moved through the house like a sleepwalker. He'd sit at the piano, but wouldn't play. He'd pick Upi's old microscope, but wouldn't look through it. Their father, Ilya, was dying. Everyone knew it, but nobody said it. Their years of traveling in open sleighs, the endless battles with the crushing disappointment of watching his schools wither under the new Tsar's restrictions. It had hollowed him out. He lay upstairs, breathing graggly, while Maria Alexandrovna moved between his bedside and the kitchen, her face a mask of competent grief. On January 12th, Vladimir watched his older brother stand by the coffin, saw something harden in Sasha's face. Later, going through papers, they found their father's last report to the Ministry of Education. Even dying, he'd been documenting the state of rural schools, counting desks and textbooks, tallying up the small victories and large defeats of his life's work. Sasha returned to Petersburg changed. His letters home grew shorter, more. He mentioned new friends, late-night meetings, important work that kept them from his studies. Maria Alexandrovna, worried. Vladimir, caught up in his final year at gymnasium, barely noticed. He was busy being brilliant, finishing first in his class, winning the gold medal, dreaming of following his brother to university. March 1st, 1887. A telegram arrived. Vladimir was playing chess with his younger brother, Dmitri, when their mother's scream shattered the afternoon quiet. Sasha had been arrested. Along with other students, he'd been caught with a bomb, planning to assassinate Alexander III on the 6th anniversary of his father's death. The news spread through Simbirsk like wildfire. The Oilenovs, that respectable family of educators and civil servants, harbored a neighbors whispered, but friends suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The director of Vladimir's gymnasium, Fodokinsky, called him into his office, not to expel him, but to express bewilderment. How could the son of Ilyoliano, that paragon of gradual form, turned to violence? The trial was swift and secret. Maria Alexandra traveled Alanito St. Petersburg. None of her husband's former colleagues would help her. None neath their respectable friends would ever acknowledge her. She sat in the courtroom and watched her eldest son refused to beg for mercy. When they asked him to speak in his own defense, Sasha gave a lecture on social justice and historical necessity. He quoted Hegel and Darwin, explaining why the evolution of society required revolutionary action. The prosecutor called him arrogant. The judges called him. His mother called him her son and wept. Sasha stood straight back in the dock, 20 years old, already seeing past the courtroom to some future where his death would mean something. He'd studied chemistry to understand the natural world. Now he would die to change the social world. They hanged him on May 8th, along with 4 other conspirators in the courtyard of Schlossberg Fortress. Therap was too thick. It took him 20 minutes to die. The authorities sent his personal effects home in a small box, some books, a photograph of his family, the gold watch his father had given him for graduating gymnasium, and a letterhead written the night before high school, telling his mother he regretted only the pain he'd caused her. Vladimir received the news. His classmates later remembered how he went completely white, how he walked out of the building without a word. They found him hours later by the Volga, staring at the water. When Simone tried to comfort him by saying Sasha was a hero, Vladimir turned and said something strange. "No, we won't go that way. That's not the what way then?" In the weeks that followed, Vladimir threw himself into his studies with new ferocity. He memorized Latin texts, solved mathematical equations, wrote essays on Roman law. But his teachers noticed a change. The eager boy who'd once debated enthusiastically in class now sat silent, watching, calculating. When he did speak, his words had an edge that made others. The Ulanovs became PARAS overnight, Friends crossed the street to avoid. The authorities watched there. Vladimir's gold medal couldn't get him into any university. Who would accept the brother of a terrorist? Only Ginsky would write him a carefully phrased to emphasize the young man's academic brilliance while distancing him from his brother's crimes. That summer, the family fled Simbesk. They sold the house for whatever they could get and retreated to Kokoshkina, the rural estate of Maria Alexandrovna. The main house was white column, gracious, a remnant of the old gentry life that was already fading. Vladimir took over a small wing, turning it into his study. He spent the months reading everything in his dead brother's trunk. Chemistry textbooks with margin notes about explosives, political pamphlets, works by Pisev and Brelub, the radical critics who'd inspired a generation of revolutionaries, and one book in particular that Sasha had underlined heavily, Chernyshev's What Is to Bedoni. The novel was terrible as literature, wooden characters, implausible plot, prose like a but Vladimir didn't read it for style. He read it for the vision of new people who rejected traditional morality and built their lives on rational principles. It's slept on nails to toughen himself for the revolutionary struggle. He ate only food that ordinary workers could afford. He turned himself into an instrument of history. Vladimir began his own transformation that summer. He started each day with cold baths and calisthenics, training his body while his mind absorbed his brother's abandoned library. He played chess against himself, analyzing each game afterward to eliminate. He walked for hours throughout the countries, always alone, always thinking. His sister Anna watched him with growing concern. The brother she'd known, who'd laughed easily and played practical jokes, was disappearing. In his place stood someone harder, more focused, frighteningly disciplined. Wench tried to talk to him about Sasha. He would listen politely, then change these objects to economic statistics, a row of By autumn, he'd read What Is to Be Done 5 times. Each reading revealed new layers. Yonesaki hadn't just written a book, he'd provided a manual for creating revolutionaries. Take yourself apart. Analyze each component. Rebuild yourself for maximum. Emotion was inefficient. Sentiment was weakness. The future belonged to those who could think clearly and act decisively. Vladimir Uliano was 17 years old, brilliant, angry, and his father's dream of gradual progress had died with him. His brother's romantic terrorism had led tough news. Somewhere between these failures lay another path. But funding it would require becoming someone new, someone harder, someone who could wait, plan, and strike only when victory was attained. The boy who'd grieved by the Volga was gone. What remained was thorough material for Lenin. Chapter 2, The Brothership. January 1886. Vladimir was 15. Home from gymnasium for the winter holidays. The house smelled of beeswax and boiled cabbage. Outside, Symbias lay buried under 3 feet of snow. Inside, something was wrong with Alexander Runov had always been the quiet one, the brilliant one, the one who could lose himself for hours in a book about earthworms or chemical reactions. No home from St. Petersburg University, he moved through the house like a sleepwalker. He'd sit at the piano but wouldn't play. He'd pick up his old microscope, but wouldn't look through it. Their father, Ilya, was dying. Everyone knew it, but nobody said it. Their years of traveling in open sleighs through the endless battles with the crushing disappointment of watching his schools wither under the Nuzar's restrictions. It had hollowed him out. He lay upstairs, breathing graggly, while Maria Alexandrovna moved between his bedside and the kitchen, her foos, a mask of competent grief. On January 12th, Vladimir watched his older brother stand by the coffin, saw something harden in Sasha's face. Later, going through papers, they found their father's last report to the Ministry of Education. Even dying, he'd been documenting the state of rural schools, counting desks and textbooks, tallying up the small victories and large defeats of his life's work. Sasha returned to Petersburg. His letters home grew shorter, more cryptic. He mentioned new friends, late-night meetings, important work that kept him from his studies. Maria Alexandrovna worried. Vladimir caught up in his final year at gymnasium barely noticed. He was busy, buying brilliant, finishing first in his class, winning the gold medal, dreaming orphaning his brother to university. March 1st, 1887, a telegram arrived. Vladimir was playing chess with his younger brother, Dmitri, when their mother's scream shattered the afternoon quiet. Sasha had been arrested. Along with other students, he'd been caught with a bomb, planning to assassinate Alexander III on the 6th anniversary of the assassination of Tsar Alexander I. The news spread through Simok like wildfire. The Ulanovs, that respectable milieu of educators and civil servants, harbored a terrorist. Neighbors whispered behind curtains. Friends suddenly remembered urgent business elsewhere. The director of Vladimir Simosnium, Fyodor Kinsky, called him into his office. Not to expel him, but to express bewilderment. How could the son of Ilya Larnov, that paragon of gradual reform, turn to violence? The trial was swift and secret. Maria Alexandrovna traveled Alenito, St. Petersburg. None of her husband's former colleagues would help her. None of their respectable friends would ever acknowledge her. She sat in the courtroom and watched her eldest son refuse to beg for mercy when they asked him to speak in his own defense. Sasha gave a lecture on social justice and historical necessity. He quoted Hegel and Darwin, explaining why the evolution of society required revolutionary action. The prosecutor called him arrogant. The judges called him irredeemable. His mother called him her son and wept. Sasha stood straight back in the dock, 20 years old, already seeing past the courtroom to some future where his death would mean something. He'd studied chemistry to understand the natural world. Now he would die to change the social world. They hanged him on May 8th, along with 4 other conspirators in the courtyard of Schlüsselburg fortress. The rope was too thick. It took him 20 minutes to die. The authorities sent his personal effects home in a small box, some books, a photograph of his family, the gold watch his father had given him for graduating gymnasium, and a letter he'd written the night before his execution, telling his mother he regretted only the pain he'd caused her. Vladimir received the news. His classmates later remembered how he went completely white, how he walked out of the building without a word. They found him hours later by the Volga, staring at the water. When Simon tried to comfort him by saying Sasha was a hero, Vladimir turned and said something strange. "No, we won't go that way." "That's not the way. What way then?" In the weeks that followed, Vladimir threw himself into his studies with new ferocity. He memorized Latin texts, solved mathematical equations, wrote essays on Roman law. But his teachers noticed a change. The eager boy who'd once debated enthusiastically in class now sat silent, watching, calculating. When he did speak, his words had an edge that made others uncomfortable. The Ulanovs became Paris overnight. Friends crossed the street to avoid them. The authorities watched at their house. Vladimir's gold medal couldn't get him into any university. Who would accept the brother of a terrorist? Only Kinski would write him a recommendation letter, carefully phrased to emphasize the young man's academic brilliance while distancing him from his brother's crimes. That summer, the family grieved in Simsk. They sold the house for whatever they could get. Later that year, after Vladimir's brief university stint in Kazan, the family would retreat to Kushkon, the rural estate of Maria Alexandrovna's family. The main house was white-columned, gracious, a remnant of the old gentry life that was already fading. Vladimir took over a small wing, turning it into his study. It was during his exile in Kokoshkanolo and his expulsion that he spent months reading intensively. He read political pamphlets denouncing autocracy, works by Pizarov and Brolob, the radical critics who'd inspired a generation of revolution. And one book in particular that Sasha had likely read and which now deeply influenced Vladimir Chernovek's What Is to Bedoni. The novel was terrible. As literature, wooden characters, implausibly prose, like a police report. But Vladimir didn't read it for style. He read it for the vision of new people who rejected traditional morality and built their lives on rational principles. Its protagonist Track slept on nails to toughen himself for the revolutionary struggle. He ate only food that ordinary workers could afford. He turned himself into an instrument of history. Vladimir began his own transformation. He started each day with cold baths and calisthenics, training his body while his mind absorbed revolutionary terachia. He played chess against himself, analyzing each game afterward a little. He walked for hours through countries, always alone, always thinking. His sister Anna watched him with growing concern. The brother Shednon, who'd laughed easily and played practical jokes, was disappearing. In his place stood someone harder, more focused, frighteningly disciplined. When she tried to talk to him about Sasha, he would listen politely, then change the subject to economic statistics or European politics. By autumn, he'd read What Is to Be done in multiple times. Each reading revealed a new layers. Chesky hadn't just written about revolution. He'd provided a manual for creating revolution. Take yourself apart, analyze each component, rebuild yourself for maximum effectiveness. Emotion was inefficient. Sentiment was weakness. The future belonged to those who could think clearly and act decisively. Vladimir Olenov was 17 years old, brilliant, angry, and completely alone. His father's dream of gradual progress had died with him. His brother's romantic terrorism had led to Thnus. Somewhere between these failures lay another path, but find would require becoming someone new, someone harder, someone who could wait, plan, and strike only when victory was. The boy who'd grieved by Thevelga was gone. What remained was thorough material for Lenin. Chapter 3. Forging a Different Path. Kazan University finally accepted him in August 1887, but Vladimironov lasted exactly 3 months. The authorities were watching for any sign of rebellion from the executor's brother. They didn't have to wait long. His first weeks at university passed quietly. Vladimir attended lectures in the law faculty, took notes in his press's handwriting, spoke to almost no one. His room in a boarding house near the university was monastically spare. A bed, a desk, a shelf of books. Other students found him unsettling. He had a way of listening that made you feel he was memorizing your words for future use. But beneath the disciplined exterior, rage simmered. Every mention of Othello's majesty, every professor's casual reference to the wisdom of autocracy, every reminder that he was here on difference, it all fed the fire. He'd come to Kazan, planning to keep his head down, earn his degree, find another way forward. The university had other plans for him. December 4th, a student meeting about university regulations turned into something larger. The inspector had announced new rules, stricter supervision of student organizations, mandatory attendance at Orthodox services, a ban on gatherings of more than 5 students without a mission. Someone shouted that they were being treated like criminals. Someone else mentioned the martyred students of Petersburg. Within minutes, the meeting became a demonstration. Vladimir stood near the front, not speaking, but present, visible, defiant. When someone asked if was related to Alexander Yulanov, he said yes, loudly, clearly. The crowd surged around him. Here was revolutionary royalty, the brother of a martyr. When the police arrived, he was among the first arrested. The officers found his name on the lists. They'd been waiting for him. The interrogation was brief. The police inspector, a man who'd clearly done this before, didn't even pretend to investigate. Your brother chose his path, he said. Will you choose the same? Vladimir stood at him, saying nothing. The inspector shrugged. Expelled, exiled to Kokoshkino under police supervision. Be grateful it's not worse. Back at Kokoshkino, Vladimir found a different kind of prison. The estate was beautiful, isolated, deadly quiet. His mother watched him constantly, terrified of losing another son. His younger siblings tiptoed around him. Even these events seemed afraid. He was the dangerous one now, the carrier of evolutionary Yankton. He turned his grandfather's old study into his workspace. Books arrived by mail. His mother, despite everything, still believed education was salvation. He ordered German philosophy, French history, English economics. It was during his subsequent time in Kazan, after restrictions were loosened, that he seriously encountered Marx. Das Kapital was a key text which studied intently. The book was legal, technically just another work of economic theory. The authorities didn't understand that it was more explicit than any bomb. Marx was different from the Russian radicals he'd read before. No moral outrage, no appeals to justice or humanity, just cold analysis of how capitalism worked, why it would destroy itself, how history moved through predictable stages. After the passion and poetry of the populists, Marx felt like switching from candlelight to electricity. Suddenly, Vladimir could see the machinery behind events. He spent the winter following his return to Kazan, constructing elaborate charts and diagrams, trying to understand Marx's formulas. His notebooks, filled with calculations about surplus value and thefting rate of profit. When the equations finally clicked, when he understood how exploitation wasn't a moral failing, but a structural necessity of capitalism, he felt some clarity he'd found in Chernysky. Here was science, not sentiment. His sister Anna herself, banned from higher education for her connection to Sasha, watched him. They would walk in There's No Covered Gardens, and he would explain Marx's discoveries with enthusiasm, others reserved for love or God. Don't you see, he'd say, it's not about good or evil. It's about understanding the laws of social development. Revolution isn't a choice, it's an inevitability. Spring came, and with it, a slight loosening of restrictions. The police allowed him to visit Kazan for a day to collect his belongings. The city felt different, smaller, shabbier, less important. He walked past the university without stopping. That chapter was closed. He was teaching himself now, preparing for struggles. The professor's COULDN, single quotes TMAGINE. His mother petitioned endlessly for Herzon's readmission to university. The authorities offered a compromise. Heckled take the law exams as an no lectures, no contact with our students, just examinations. It was humiliating, but Vladimir accepted. A law degree was a tool, nothing more. He'd use whatever tools were available. He organized his studies like a military campaign. For hours of Roman law, 2 hours of civil procedure, 1 hour of legal history. He managed to prepare for and pass a demanding set of exams. When he finally sat for the exams in St. Petersburg in 1891, he scored exceptionally well. The professors were amazed. How had an ex-Celeste Diangalin outperformed their best students? They didn't understand that Vladimir wasn't studying to become a lawyer. He was studying to understand enemies. Every law, every procedure, every legal fiction revealed how the ruling class maintained power. The knowledge would be useful from day one. The old laws were swept away and new ones written. With his degree in hand, he returned to Samara, where his mother had moved the family in 1889. He went through the motions of starting a legal practice. His business card written, assistant attorney. He rented an office, bought the required legal texts, waited for clients. They came, peasants who'd been cheated by landlords, workers fired without pay. He took their cases, argued competently. The real work happened after horsing the illegal study circles that met in back rooms and private apartments. Vladimir attended with growing authority. He wasn't just another Angrian man anymore. He could quote Marx in German, explain the development of Russian capitalism with statistics, demolish populist arguments with surgical precision. The terrorists wanted to blow up the system. The populists wanted to bypass it. Vladimir wanted to understand it, master it, use its own logic again. One evening in Samara, during a particularly heated discussion about revolutionary tactics, Vladimir not a pleasant laugh. His sister Anna, who was there, later cadet, metallic. When asked what was funny, he said the whole discussion reminded him of people arguing about the best way to kill a bear before anyone had found bear or loaded their rifle. First, he argued they needed to understand Russian capitalism, how it was developing, where it was vulnerable. Then they needed to identify the social forces that would destroy it. Only then could they talk about tactics. Everything else was revolutionary-finized, as useless as his brother's bombs. By 1892, he was writing his own, not the passionate calls to action that filled the illegal press, but dense economic studies backed by government statistics. How many factories had opened in the last decade? How many peasants had PUM workers? What did the growth of the railroad network mean for such dry questions? But Vladimir believed the answers contained the future. His legal practice withered. He had no talent for courtroom drama and less interest. His mother supported Heimers, always, supplementing his meager earnings with family money. He lived simply, spent nothing on himself, used every kopeck for books and paper. He was 22 years old, brilliant, disciplined, and absolutely certain he'd found Becky to tomorrow. All he needed now was an organization worthy of his certainty. The provinces were too small for what he envisioned St. Petersburg called the industrial heartland, Deplis, where theory could beckon. In August 1893, he closed his failed law practice, packed his books, and bought a third-train ticket north. The real work was about to begin. Chapter 4: The Unfold Banner. Vladimir arrived in St. Petersburg on August 31st, 1893, stepping off the train into a city that assaulted every sense. The Finland station teemed with peasants seeking factory work, their bundles and balded faces marking them as fresh from the countryside. Smoke from 1,000 chimneys turned the afternoon sun into a dim orange disk. The air tasted of coal and humus. He found a room on Kazakia Street near, enough to the factories to hard hear morning whistles, but respectably to avoid police attention. Theland lady, a German widow, appreciate his quiet habits and prompt rent payments. She had no idea her Studiestenant would one day order the execution of thousands like her. The Marxist circles in Petersburg, different from the provincial dissidents groups he'd known. These people had connections to actual workers. They printed illegal newspapers, hidden cellars. They knew which factory foreman would look the other way during lunch hour meetings. Vladimir threw himself into this world with but something bothered him from Thest. Everyone agreed on the basics. Capitalism was evil. Revolution was. History was on their side. What nobody could explain was how they'd get from here to there. The populists still dreamed of peasant communes, somehow leaping straight to socialism. The terrorists still believed few well-placed bombs could bring down the autocracy. The Marxists knew better, but their knowledge hadn't translated into a practical. Vladimir spent his first months listening, learning, mapping the underground's geography. There was Thebrenev group, mostly students who discovered Marx. The Ryanko circle, which had better worker contacts. Various Polish and Jewish socialists with their all revolutionary, all illegal, all talking past each other in a babble of competing. He tested his ideas carefully at first. In a meeting about worker education, he argued that teaching literacy wasn't enough. Workers needed to understand their historical role when discussing strike support. He insisted on connecting economic demands to political consciousness. Gradually, people began to notice the young lawyer from the province's hawk-witted statistics like scripture and never seemed to doubt. That winter, he began writing what would become his first major theoretical work. The manuscript grew through the dark months, fueled by endless cigarettes and cups of tea. Heckled it what the friends of the peer play and how they fight the social The title dripped. The friends were populist intellects who claimed to love the people Willem misunderstanding everything about them. But Vladimir's real target was it was confusion itself. Their evolutionary movements, inability to see clearly. Page after page, he hammered home his Russia was becoming capitalist, whether anyone liked it or not. The old peasant commune was dying. Modern industry was being born, and with it came the force that would destroy it, the industrial proletariat. He painted history as a 3-act dramas outlined in his banner sentence from this work. Act 1 involved the creation of Russian social democracy, advanced. Representatives of the working class would assimilate socialist ideas. Durably, organizations would transform sporadic struggles into a purposeful class struggle. Act 2 focused on the democratic revolution. The Russian worker leading all democratic elements would overthrow absolutism. Act 3 envisioned the social revolution. The Russian proletariat, alongside the proletariat of all countries, would take the direct road of open political struggle to the victorious communist revolution. Simple, elegant, inevitable. But Vladimir added something new. The protagonist of this drama, not people in some vague romantic sense, not the peasants with their ancient travances. The urban industrial workers and, specifically, the conscious workerschwar understood that historical mission. They would be the engine of Revolution, the manuscripts circulated through the underground in handwritten copies. Vladimir insisted on using a hectograph, a primitive copying device using gelatin and purple ink to produce cleaner versions. Each page had to be pressed by hand, the purple letters growing fainter with each copy. He worked through the nights, his fingers stained violet, producing dozens of copies for distribution. The response was electric. Here was someone who wasn't just complaining about the present, but mapping the future. Someone who could quote Marx in one paragraph and Russian factory statistics in the next. Someone who wrote like he knew exactly where history was heading and had bought Histicut in advance. The purple pamphlets, passed from hand to hand, read in workers' barracks and student apartments. But Vladimir wasn't satisfied with theoretical victory. He wanted to test his ideas in practice. Through the underground network, he made a contact with workers from the sub. These weren't the grey masses of populist imagination, but thinking. Ivan Babushkin, who read of everything he could find. Vasily Shalov, who organized his shop floor with. He met them in tea shops, and always careful, always watching for police spies. But instead of lecturing, he listened. How did workers actually work? What grievances burned? Which foremen were tyrants and which merely incompetent? He took notes like an anthropologist, studying a new. From these conversations came a new kind of leaflet. Not abstract calls for revolution, but specific demands, tailored to each factory. The Thornton mill workers wanted ventilation. Their leaflet explained how cotton dust destroyed lungs and why British factories had fans. The Pilov workers faced arbitrary fines. Their leaflet titled every illegal deduction. Namit guilty foreman demanded precisimity. Each leaflet ended the same way, connecting the immediate struggalato, the larger war. Your fight for cleaner is part of the fight for human dignity. Your demand for fair wages is aidment for justice. Unite with your fellow, first in your shop, then in your factory, then across all Petersburg. You have nothing to lose, but Vladimir supervised every detail. The paper had to be thin in auto-hide, but strong enough to pass through many hands. The type had to be clear. Workers read by candlelight after exhausting shifts. The language had to be simple, without binding. Each word was weighed, tested, refined. By spring of 1894, his network reached into a dozen factories. Workers would never heard of Marx 6 months ago, explaining surplus value to their bondmates. Study circles met in workers' apartments, disguised as nowadays celebrations or funeral gatherings. Thespok was catching. Slowly but surely. Vladimir began dreaming bigger. Leaflets were good, but they needed a newspaper, something regular, professional, that could bind scattered dirgles into a real movement. He sketched plans in his notebooks, calculating costs, planning distribution, imagining a publication that would be the scaffolding for a future party. That summer he met Nadezhda Krupskaya at a Shrove, Tuesday gathering of radicals. She taught at workers' evening schools, turning literacy lessons into political. Vladimir watched her explain complex ideas using simple objects, matchboxes for factories, kopecks, breadcrumbs for surplus value. Here was someone who understood that revolution required patience and pedagogy. They began working together, sharing contacts and information. She had access to workers he couldn't reach, women in the textile mills, teenagers in the cigarette factories. He provided theoretical clarity and organization. It wasn't romance in any conventional sense, but something deeper, a recognition of shared. By autumn, the authorities were noticing increased unrest in police reports mentioned mysterious leaflets, unexpected work stoppages, workers asking uncomfortably. They couldn't find thieves. Vladimir had learned from his brother's mistakes. No bombs, no dramatic gestures, just patient building off networks that grew like roots beneath the city. Years later, when Vladimir Ulyanov had become Lenin, and his three-act play had somehow actually happened, though nothing like he'd imagined, people would trace it back to this moment. A young man in a cold room in Petersburg, pressing purple letters onto cheap paper, absolutely certain he'd found the key to tomorrow. The certainty would carry him through prison, exile, and it would also blind him to possibilities he'd never imagined, tragedies his schemer couldn't. But that was still to come. For no, there was only the work, the careful, patient work of turning theory into practice. One leaflet, one worker, one factory at a time. The bear was out there somewhere in the Russian darkness. Vladimir was loading his rifle with ideas, sharper than any bullet. When the moment came, he would be ready. His story had promised him that much. Chapter 5. Petersburg Skaldron. The winter of 1894 descended on Petersburg like a great ice formed on the inside off windows. Coal smoke hung so thick you could taste it. And in the workers' districts, families huddled together, burning furniture when the coal ran out. In this frozen city, Vladimir Ulyanov's underground network grew like frost on glass, invisible until suddenly it weighs. He'd established a routine of thought, looked respectable to any watching Polars. Morning walks along Nevka Prospect, afternoons in the public library, evenings at home with his. But the walks included coded conversations at predetermined corners. The library visits meant messages left in agreed-upon volumes. The quiet vannings were spent writing leaflets that would soon have factory owner screaming for blood. The Marxist circles were coalescing into something larger. Vladimir had identified the serious revolutionary from the mere talkers. Those willing to risk prison from Thasuhu preferred theoretical debates over There was Glebki, Zanovsky, an engineer who understood machinery, both industrial. There was Peter Struve, brilliant but soft, already showing signs of the liberalism that would later split them apart. And there was Julius Mto, who arrived that autumn like a comet trailing revolutionary fire, where Vladimir Warsel, discipline and calculation, burned with empathy for human suffering. He was younger, Jewish, perpetually disheveled, with wire-rimmed spectacles that couldn't hide eyes that had seen too much too young. They met at an underground gathering and recognized each other instantly, not as friends, but as necessary partners in the work ahead. MH brought connections to the Jewish workers in the Pale of Settlemento, Polish socialists to radical students Vladimir's austere manner couldn't reach. Together they walked the frozen Neva embankment, arguing about revolutionary strategy while their breath crystallized in the Arctic air. Both were committed to advancing Thuakers's cause and political calculances, though they might deeper to the immediate tactics. Neither convinced the other entirely, but both recognized he needed what the other offered. Through Krupskaya's evening classes, Vladimir gained access to a different layer of workers. Not their skilled metal workers who already questioned their conditions, but textile girls who worked 16-hour days. Children would never learned to read. Old women cleaned the factories at night. Krupskaya taught them letters by day and revolution by night, using the same patient method for both. One December evening, Vladimir observed one of her classes. 20 workers, crammed into a freezing basement, learning Torah from texts that just happened to explain exploitation. The worker Celsius labor. They recited the owner steals, the value. Basic sentences that planted seeds in minds numbed by exhaustion. Vladimir saw how hunger for education could become hunger for justice. He was developing his own teaching method inspired by the German Social Democrats, but adapted to Russian conditions. Start with the foreman who cheated on piecework. The fines for being mean. The woman fired for refusing the manager's advances. Connect these to why did all foremen cheat? Why were fines legal? Why did managers have such power? Then reveal the system behind it all. Capitalism required the state protected the only revolution could break Thekony. But teaching required students, and Vladimir needed to understand his pupils better. He spent hours with advanced workers like Ivan Babushkin, not lecturing but listening. Babushkin described how skilled workers felt superior to peasant newcomers, how ethnic Russians resented Polish and Jewish workers, how men dismissed women's complaints. The proletariat of Marxist theory was divided by 1,000 prejudices. Unity would have to be built, no tassemed. Vladimir adjusted his approach. Leaflets for the Putilov worksome faced Russian workers' traditions of resistance. Those 4 textile mills spoke to women's double burden of factory and family. Materials for Thepet workers acknowledged the specific dangers of their trade. Same message, different keys, all tuned to locale frequencies. The police were catching up. The Irana had infiltrated most revolutionary circles, but Vladimir's cell structure made complete penetration difficult. Each member knew only their immediate. Messages moved through cutouts and dead drops. Meetings rotated locations weekly. When veteran revolutionary criticized these precautions as paranoid, Vladimir reminded them how many veterans were inside. By spring of 1895, the network was producing a stream of propaganda, not just leaflets now, but longer pamphlets explaining economic theory and workers' language. Vladimir wrote most of them, but always collectively edited. MTO would add emotional appeals. Grubskaya would simplify. Gryanovsky would check technical details. The final products bore no single style. They were a genuinely collective works. Success brought new problems. More workers meant more expenses. Paper, printing, safe houses, support, forful timor. The circle's middle-classmen contributed what they could, but it wasn't enough. Vladimir proposed approaching liberal factory owners, who might support worker education. MTO was horrified, taking money from Vladimir's response, waste. When the revolution comes, we'll confiscate theirs. That May, Vladimir received next news. The authorities had granted him a passport for foreign travel, probably hoping he'd emigrate. Instead, he saw Europe was where the real social democratic parties operated, Bentley, where Marx's ideas had built these movements. He would go learn their methods, make connections, perhaps find. The Russian movement needed to emerge from its. Before leaving, he spent a week transferring. MTO would maintain worker contacts. Kayskaya would continue education work. Kijanovsky would handle technical matters. Each had addresses for emergency communication, codes for different levels of urgency, fallback plans if forests began. Vladimir prepared for every contingency except the one that occurred. His own transformation by Waith would see. His last night in Petersburg, the inner circle gathered in a safe apartment near the Technoch. They drank tea, smoked endless cigarettes. talked until dawn about the future they were building. Emter spoke of the day when workers would control their own factories. Kubsky imagined schools where children learn a truth instead of superstition. Vladimir said little, but when pressed, admitted dreamed of a party, disciplined, centralized, professional, that would focus revolutionary energy like a lens. They parted as the sun rose over city's smokestacks. Vladimir Wokoto, the Warsaw station, alone, carrying Gani's suitcase and a head full of plans. He was 25 years old, absolutely certain of his path, about to discover how much still had to learn. Switzerland waited, and with it, Platonoff, the father of Russian Marxism. Then Germany, where the Social Democrats had millions of members. Then London, where Marx himself had worked. The train pulled out past factories where workers were beginning their shifts. Some carried lethal shidden in their clothes. Words Vladimir had written now, spreading through the industrial bloodstream of the city. Thespark was lit. Now he would learn how to open it into flame. He settled into Hisiat, pulled out a German grammar, and began to study. There was so much work ahead. Chapter 6. The Exhilaration of Strike. Vladimir crossed the border in summer of 1895, watching Russia disappear behind him. First stop, Switzerland, where Plekhanov and the old guard of Russian Marxism lived in exile. He traveled third class, saving money, observing how European workers dressed, moved, spoke. Every detail mattered for the party he was designing. In his shed, Geneva disappointed him. The Russian exiles met in the same caves where revolutionaries had argued for decades, repeating the same debates about terrorism versus propaganda, peasants versus workers. Plekhanov himself, the legendary translator of Marx, turned out to be vain, pedantic, more concerned with theoretical purity than practical organization. When Vladimir described his Petersburg work, Plekhanov's reaction was not the enthusiastic endorsement he might have hoped for. But Vladimir learned what he could. The exiles had connections across Europe, access to printing facilities, experience smuggling literature into. He took notes on everything. Which borders were easiest to cross? Which shipping companies asked fewer questions? How to hide pamphlets in legal book shipments. Revolution required logistics as much as ideology. From Switzerland to France, where he met Paul Lafroux, Marx's son, the old man reminisced about the founder, while Vladimir pressed for practical details. How had Marx organized the first international? What mistakes had been? Lafroux was more interested in telling stories about Marx's Carbonlisten, discussing organization. But Vladimir extracted with Kudot, then Germany, the promised land of social democracy. Berlin, a modern industrial city that made Petersburg look medieval. The Social Democratic Party had 3 million members, 90 newspapers, representatives. They operated openly, held massive rallies, ran schools and libraries. This was what success looked like. He met Wilhelm Lee, the party's grand old man, who received him kindly, but clearly saw him as just another Russian dreamer. Vladimir attended party meetings, watched how they were run, the formal procedures, the voting mechanisms, the way disputes were channeled into productive debate rather than faction fights. He filled notebook after notebook with but something bothered. The German party was too comfortable, too legal, too invested in gradual reform. They talked about revolution while acting like a permanent opposition. When Vladimir suggested their methods might not work under Tsarist repression, his hosts smiled condescendingly. Russia would democratize, eventually, they assured. Then Russian Social Democrats, could operate like civilized Europeans. In Berlin's workers' districts, he found a different story. Rank-and-file members complained that leadership had grown conservative, more interested in parliamentary seats than revolution. The party's success had pumped its cage. Vladimir filed Thislison away. Legal operation could be as dangerous as underground conspiracy if it dulled revolution edge. By August, he was back in Russia, his head spinning with new knowledge. But Petersburg had changed in his... The network he'd carefully built was expanding beyond his plans. Workers were organizing themselves, demanding action, not waiting for intellectual guidance. Some comrades saw us as wonderful. Vladimir saw danger, movement without direction, energy without... He threw himself back into work with renewed intensity, using German methods adapted to Russian conditions. He restructured the Circle Sinto, a more Each factory would have its own cell. Cells would cordon districts through a information would flow up, decisions down like the German party, but built for illegality. That autumn brought an expected opportunity. Management at several textile factories announced wage cuts, blaming foreign competition. Workers who'd been reading underground leaflets for months suddenly had immediate reason to act. Strikes began sporadically, a shop here, a department there. Vladimir and his comrades worked frantically to coordinate them to transform spontaneous protests into... December 8, 1895. Vladimir sat in his room writing Alaflay about the latest factory abusation. He heard footsteps on the stairs, too heavy for his landlady, too purposeful for a casual visitor. He had sockens to burn the most The police broke down his door just as the last pages caught flame. They arrested 40 others. The Ukraina had been watching longer than anyone realized, letting the network grow before striking. Emtov, Krianovsky, most of the central circle taken. Only Krupskaya escaped the first sweep, managing to destroy membership lists before her own arrest. 3 months later, Vladimir found himself in the house of preliminary detention, the same fortress prison where his brother had spent his last weeks. The authorities seemed almost disappointed by their catch. No bombs, no assassinations, both just leaflets about working conditions and German books about economics. They had expected terrorists and found but outside the prison walls, something extraordinary was happening. The arrests, rather than crushing the movement, catalyzed it. Workers who'd hesitated to act now had martyrs Tovenge. The strikes that had been simmering all autumn exploded into By June 1896, 30,000 textile workers had walked off the job. The largest strike in Russian history. In his cell, Vladimir could hear the workers marching past prison, singing the songs Krukaya had, chanting demands he'd help it. Everything he'd theorized was happening without him. Workers discovering their power, connecting geoconic and political demands, learning through struggle what no leaflet could teach. He pressed against his window, trying to see the crowds. Guards reported he seemed almost happy despoting. He was. The strikes validated everything. Russian workers weren't backward peasants, but a genuine proletariat capable of organized action. The spark had caught. Now it was spreading on its own logic. The strikes were a major event. The government, terrified of wide unrest, eventually passed a law in June 1897 that limited work. More important was the psychological shift. Workers had tasted. They wanted more. In prison, Vladimir analyzed every detail he could glean from lawyers' visits and smuggled messages. Why had some factories held firm while others? How had workers maintained their disciple without experienced leaders? Which demands resonated most? He filled notebook after notebook, preparing for battles yet to come. The authorities faced a dilemma. The prisoners were clearly dangerous, but trials might provoke more unrest. After 14 months, they chose administrative exile. 3 years in Siberia, far from factories and workers, Vladimir received the sentence calmly. Siberia meant time to think, to write, to prepare for the next round. As he prepared for exile, messages arrived from comrades still free. The movement had survived theorists, even grown. New people had stepped forward. Workers who'd participated in the strikes were teaching others. The underground Vespers continued publishing. The organization he'd built proved more durable than its. His last days in Petersburg were spent writing instructions for those who remained. Keep the factory cells, maintain security procedures, connect economic agitation to political goals, and above all, prepare for his. This was just the first act. The real drama was yet to come. January 1897. Vladimir boarded the train for Siberia, manacled boot and broken. Through the window, he watched the city's smokestacks disappear. Somewhere in those factories, workers carried hidden leaflets, attended prepared for struggles ahead. The spark had become a flame. His job now was to think about how to forge that flame into a weapon that could shatter an empire. 3 years in Siberia should be no time to designate. Chapter 7, Siberian Interlude. Global Vision. The journey to Shushensko took 12 months. First the Trans-Siberian Railway as far as it went. Then sledges through forests where wolves howled in the darkness. Finally, a riverboat down the Yanis as the ice began to break. With each mile, Europe receded and Asia swallowed him. Vladimir watched from the train window as Russia revealed its true vastness, its stubborn refusal to fit into any theory. He arrived in May 1897 to find Shushensko wasn't the frozen hell he'd expected. The village sat in a valley ringed by mountains, with clean air that made his Petersburg-demarged lungs ache with forgotten hell. Political exiles were allowed to live freely within the district, rent rooms from locals, receive mail and money. The Tsarist state, for all its cruelty, maintained odd pockets of civility. Vladimir rented 2 rooms from a prosperous peasant, one for sleeping, one for working. Within days, he'd established a routine as rigid as any prison schedule. Rise at 8. Cold bath in the Enos. For hours off writing lunch. 2 hours of reading. Long walk, evening chess with fellow exiles. Bed at midnight. The same every day. As if revolution could be accomplished through sheer His mother sent money monthly, supplementing the government allowance. Vladimir used it to order books, crate after crate arriving from Moscow, Petersburg, Berlin, Marx, and Engels, of course, but also statistics on Russia, German philosophy, French history, English economics. His peasant landlord, watching the library grow, asked death he was planning to open a school. In a way, Vladimir replied, the first project was massive, proving scientifically that Russia was becoming capitalist, not because he liked the idea, but because revolution required a proletariat and a proletariat-tried capitalism. The populists still insisted Russia could skip capitalismentary, jump straight from peasant communes to socialism. Beautiful dream, but dreams didn't make a revolution. He gathered statistics like here, miser hoarding, gold, railway construction miles, factory output figures. grain export data, rural employment rates. Each number was a bullet in his theoretical arsenal. Page by page, table by table, he built an irrefutable case. Russia was in. Whether romantics liked it or not, the peasant commune was wage labor was spreading. History. 800 pages later, the development of capitalism in Russia was complete, dry as dust. But Vladimir didn't entertain. He wrote to prove that Trucian Marxists weren't dreamers, but chantists observing an object. The book would be. The censors saw only economic statists, missing the revolutionary Mikliks. Kruskaya arrived in May 1898, having manipulated her exile to join him. They married in July, with copper rings, borrowed from witnesses, more merger than romance. She brought news from European Russia. The movement served but lacked direction. Differentities pursued different strategies. Some focused on economic strikes, others on student protests, still others on terrorism. Without central leadership, energy dissipated in order. Together, they developed their solution. A newspaper, not the local leaflets they'd produced before, but aerial publication printed abroad and smuggled throughout Russia. It would be called Iskra, the spark from the Decemberist poem. From a spark will come. Every issue would carry tactical guidance, theoretical notion, and practical news. Most importantly, it would be the scaffolding ground which a real party could. But a newspaper required more than good. It needed money, printing facilities, distribution networks, and above all, writers who could translate Marxist theory into Russian practice. Vladimir began corresponding with comrades across the empire, building support, delegating tasks. From his Siberian isolation, he was constructing an organization that existed mainly in his imagination. The plan grew more ambitious. Not just a newspaper, but a wall system. Professional devotional work in full-time, supported by party funds, moving between cities under false. An underground army, as disciplined as any military force, but fighting with ideas instead of guns. Local committees would have autonomy, but unity in strategy, democratic discussion, but around discipline once decisions were made. Fellow exiles visited regularly, drawn by Vladimir's certainty. They'd sit around the saber debating organization principles. Why mosquitoes? Wine through Siberian dusk. Some argued for loose federation. Let each city find its own way. Vladimir insisted on centralization. The autocracy is centralized, he'd say. We can't fight it with anarchy. He was changing in exile, becoming harder, more focused. The young man who'd grieved for his brother was buried under layers of theory and strategy. Grubskaya watched the transformation with admiration tinged beneath. The Vladimir, who emerged from his study each evening, seemed less human, more instrument. Even his jokes had edges that cut. Letters arrived from the West with troubling news. Some comrades were abandoning revolutionary goals, talking about legal trade unions and Edward Bernstein in Germany was revising Marx, arguing capitalism might reform itself peacefully. In Russia, legal Marxists like Struve were sliding toward liberalism. The movement was fracturing before it had properly. Vladimir's responses was savage. Revisionism was betrayal. Legal Marxism was bourgeois infection. Reform was a ruling class trick. His letters grew longer, angrier, filled with warnings about ideal. Revolution wasn't a buffet where you chose dishes to taste. It was all or nothing. Victory. By late 1899, his exile was winding down. Theopolis would allow him to live anywhere except major cities. He planned, along with Emtov and Padrasov, to go abroad to establish their newspaper. His last months in Shushensko were spent in feverish He drafted the newspaper. Frostgram outlined its first-year issues, calculated printing costs, and smuggling routes. Groups coded addresses of reliable comrades across the empire. Everything was ready except the His term of exile ended in early 1900. Vladimir stood on the frozen Yonus for the last time, watching Thesan set behind mountains that had bounded his world for 3 years. Siberia had been his university and monastery combined, a place to think without distraction, to forge himself into the instrument history required. The boy-wode arrived was gone. What remained was Lenin, though he didn't use that. The journey back to European Russia versed his earlier exile, riverboat to railway. But Vladimir Baralinatist, the landscape. His mind wazy ready in Switzerland, Germany, London, wherever Iskra would be born. The spark had survived Siberia. Now it was time to spread the. He left Shashansk with 2 suitcases, one full of clothes, one full of manuscripts. The clothes would wear out within months. The manuscripts would help destroy an empire. At the railway station, saying goodbye to someone asked if he'd missed. "I'll be back," Vladimir said. Everyone laughed, thinking he meant a satirist. History had died. Chapter 8: The Spark and the Pen. In July 1900, Vladimir crossed the Russian border, traveling on a mission that would consume the next 17 years after his Siberian exile ended in early 1900. He had met with comrades like Emo van Patrice to concert their plans. Ahead lay Western Europe, where Iskra would be born, or the Russian Revolution would remain forever stillborn. His first stop, after initial meetings in Geneva, was Munich, where German comradeship offered printing facilities. The city overwhelmed him with its bourgeois prosperity. Beer gardens where workers drank alongside their bosses. Streets so clean you could eat off them, a social peace that made revolution seem like madness. But Vladimir wasn't there for beer. He needed a press, paper, and a bove, all collaborators who shared his. The negotiations proved harder than expected. Plechinov, the grand old man of Russian Marxism, displayed his characteristic prickliness. Axel radented the paper to focus on theoretical adduction. Zazalik insisted on including appeals to liberal conscience. Everyone agreed Iskra was necessary. Butish had their own vision of what it would be. Vladimir spent weeks in Swiss caves, managing egos as carefully as any diplomat. Finally, a compromise emerged. 6 editors, the old guard of Plechinov, Axelrod, and Zaspulik, plus the younger generation of Lenin, Emtov, and Patrasov, decisions by majority vote. Vladimir acted, knowing he could outwork and outmaneuver the others. Let them have their votes. He would have the newspaper. The first issue appeared in December 1900. 8 pages of tightly printed text, smuggled into Russia in full-sported suitcases and sewn into The masthead carried them. From a spark will come a inside articles on strikes, theoretical essays, tactical advice, and Vladimir's editorial setting out their program. Not just a newspaper, but the scaffolding for a revolutionary party. Distribution was its own revolution. Networks of smugglers carried bundles across borders. Students with hollowed-out textbooks, merchants with Dublin trunks, sailors with waterproof packages. Inside Russia, thepapers moved through chains of safe houses, each link knowing only the next. A copy might travel thousands of miles, be read by hundreds before finalizing. Vladimir wrote obsessively, for every issue, articles. Some signed N. Lenin, a pseudonym he began using around 1901. Possibly from a passport he'd attained, appeared on everything from factory conditions to philosophical discussions. His style had crystallized in Excel. Short sentences like hammer blows, statistics deployed like artillery, sarcasm that could strike. Readers either loved or hated Lenin's voice. None ignored. But his most important work of this period was a book that would transform Russian socialism. Published in 1902, What is to be Done? Took its title from Chernyshky's novel that had Shepedis's youth. But the content was pure. The spontaneous strike movement was good, he argued, beautiful. Workers on their own could only develop trade union consciousness, fighting for better conditions within capitalism. Revolutionary consciousness had to be brought from outside by revolutionaries armed with science. The book outlined his vision of thepity, systematizing methods developed by social democratic activists. He argued for a corps of trained professional vocational, dedicated to the cause essential for operating effectively under Russian conditions of He emphasized the need for a stable organization capable of guiding burgeoning worker movement inspired by the principles of European social democracy, but adapted to the specific lenses of the Russian underground democracy. Free discussion until a decision was made then. Absolute unity in action. He used a military metaphor that would haunt Russian socialism. The party would be like an army's general staff, few working class like soldiers. Generals would take votes before ordering. They studied the battlefield, made plans, issued commands. Democracies for peace. Russia was at war. Give us an organization of revolutionaries, he wrote, and we will avert on Russia. The sentence crystallized his conviction in the power of a dedicated, organized vanguard. This was not necessarily a break with traditional social democracy in his mind, but his focused application to the urgent task of making revolution in an autocratic state. Built on confidence in the workers' revolutionary potentially one. The book landed like a bomb in revolutionary circles. Some hailed it as the practical program they'd been. Others denounced it as elitist, conspiratorial, a recipe for. Plenov, who'd initially supported Lenin, began having second thoughts. This wasn't the democratic socialism Marx had envisioned, but something harder, more Russian, more Adan. Meanwhile, Iskra was succeeding beyond anyone's dreams. Each issue reached deeper into Russia, creating a common vocabulary for factory workers in Petersburg read the same articles as Jewish Bundists in Poland, Georgian nationists in Tiflis, students in Moscow. The newspaper was becoming what Lenin had envisioned, not just propaganda, but an organizing tool. But success brought problems. As Iskra's influence grew, so did disputes among its editors. Plenov resented Lenin's productivity and growing authority. Murmured about the authoritarian implication of what is to be done. Zazulik found Lenin's contempt for liberals disturbing. The editorial board meetings became a battlegrounds, with Vladimir usually slated, but never attributed. He compensated by building his own network within the network. Younger comrades drawn to his clarity and discipline became Iskra, agent spreading his particular interpretation of the newspaper's line. When local committees wrote for advice, Lenin always answered first and masterfully. Gradually, imperceptibly, Iskra was becoming Lenin's paper, in fact, if not in name. The work was exhausting. Writing articles, editing submissions, managing distribution, maintaining correspondence with dozens of committees, fighting with creditors, all while living on party stipends that barely covered rent and food. Vladimir developed headaches that would plague him for life. Krupskaya joined him after completing her Excel, managed the practical details while he focused on By 1902, they'd moved to London drive-in from Munich. By police pressure, the British capital suited Lenin. Better no one paid attention to foreign revolutionists scribbling in the British Museum. He spent days where Marx had worked reading colonial reps and factory. Statistics confirm his analysis of imperialism role in postponing European revolution. London also meant proximity to the heart of world capitalism. Vladimir studied everything: how parliament functioned, how trade unions operated, how the ruling class maintained control through concession and cooptation rather than pure force. These lessons would prove invaluable. He finally held power, though he dappled them in the Second Congress of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was scheduled for summer 1903. It would be Iskra's triumph. Delegation, largely from newspapers, the agenda shaped by its political line. Lenin, preparatically, drafting rules, lining up votes, anticipating objections. This will be the moment his organization Alvians became reality. He had no idea he was preparing for a split that would define the rest of his life. The party he'd spent years building was about to tear itself apart, creating the fundamental division of Russian socialism. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, hards and softs, Lenin's disciples and everyone else. The spark had indeed created a conflagration. Now Vladimir would learn that fires on Sestat burn in directions no one can control. But that spring in London, writing in the same library where Marx had labored, Vladimir allowed himself a moment of sadism. Iskra reached every corner of the Russian Empire. What is to Bedoni, who's debated in every underground circle? His vision of professional evolution was becoming. Soon, very soon, they would have their organization of revolutionaries, and then they would overturn Asia. Chapter 9. A party divided. The Second Congress convened in Brussels in August 1903, in a flower warehouse festooned with red bunting. 57 delegates, representing 26 organizations, gathered to forge Russians' social democracy into a real party. Vladimir had spent months preparing, but revolutions, even small-ones in Belgian warehouses, never follow scripts. From the first session, problems emerged. The Jewish Bund demanded autonomy within the party. Polish socialists wanted recognition. As sole representatives of Polish workers, economists argued for focus on immediate. Each group had read Iskra differently, seen their own hopes reflected in its pages. Now they discovered these hopes were in. Vladimir sat in the presidium, taking notes in his meticulous hand, cataloguing friends and enemies. He'd arrived with what seemed like a solid Iskra majority. But majorities, he was learning, were as unstable as Russian spring ice. Every vote revealed new fractures. All dalliances dissolved over procedural questions that masked deeper disagreements about revolution's meaning. The Belgian police, pressured by the Russian embassy, shut down the Congress after a week. The delegates escaped to London, reconvening in Aidinger Hall, usually used for socialist lectures and workers' celebrations. The venue's Shabbos seemed. Here was Russian social democracy supposedly ready to overthrow an empire unable to secure a dissent. Then came the explosion. Paragraph 1 of the party rules. Lenin proposed that members must personally participate in party organizations. MTO countered that personal participation was anyone who supported the party should be considered a member. The difference seemed trivial, but both men understood its. Lenin wanted professional revolutionaries. Mov wanted a mass movement. The debate consumed into. Lenin argued that loose membership meant polizon, that Russian conditions demanded conspiracy, that better to have 10 real workers than a 100 sympathizers. Mart replied that Lenin's formula would create a sect of intellectual scammed-in, passive masses, that socialism meant democracy, that wars between party and class would predict. When the vote came, Lenin lost on this crucial point regarding party membership definition. But politics, like chess rewards patience. Later votes on other issues saw walkouts be the bunt and economists. On some subsequent matters, Lenin's faction found itself in the majority. He seized the moment, attempting to solidify his influence on key party bodies. MTO exploded. This was a coup, he shouted. A violation of comradely ethics. How could Lenin try to sidle in arrested figures? But Vladimir remained. They had voted, hadn't they? The majority had decided on those latter issues. From now on, his supporters will be called Bolsheviks. Majoritarians, EMS group, Bekamencheviks. The names stuck even after. Subsequent events made thematically absurd. The Congress ended in chaos. Martefest, to serve on an editorial board, felt was unfairly constituted. Plekhanov, appalled by the split, initially tried to mediate, but eventually leaned away from Lenin's hard line. Within months, Lenin found himself increasingly isolated, and by the end of the year was forced to leave the editorial board. The leader of a faction whose future was uncertain. The party head spent years building had shattered, but defeat taught Lenin more than victory could have. In Geneva, writing furious pamphlets defending his position, he developed the ideas that would define. The party needed discipline because history offered only revolutionary momentum, rarely. Miss them and wait decades for another chance that are a small sharp sword than a large dull club. He also learned about betrayal. Plekhanov, his theoretical mentor, now called him a dictator. Imtov, his close comrade, painted him as power-hungry. Even Group Sky questioned whether he'd been too harsh. But Lenin had crossed this Rubicon. Soft sentiments were full. Revolution required hardness all. Then in January 1905, history provided its verdict. News arrived from Petersburg. Troops had fired on workers marching to hundreds dead, thousands. The massacre triggered strikes, mutinies, uprisings across the empire, while Social Democrats bickered in exile. Russian workers and peasants began their own revolution. Lenin watched from Geneva with fascination and frustration. Everything was happening too fast, without propagandization. Workers formed their own councils, Soviets ignoring party guidance. Peasants burned manor houses without reading Marx. Sailors mutinied on the battleship Pemkan without consulting profession revolutionaries. The masses were writing their own script. This was what he'd wanted. Spontaneity without consciousness, energy without direction. Yet he couldn't deny the revolution's grandeur. Workers who'd never heard of socialism were creating embryonic. Peasants who couldn't read were destroying centuries of oppression. Perhaps the masses understood more than intellectuals gave them credit for. He threw himself into analyzing events, writing article after article for the New Bolshevik paper. The Mensheviks' Argadath revolution must be bourgeois, overthrowing Tsarism to establish capitalism, with workers playing a supporting role. Lenin developed a different formula: democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry. Workers would lead, bringing peasants along, pushing the bourgeois revolution to its limits sunbeyond. By autumn, he could stand Geneva no longer. Despite the risks, he was still wanted by the police. Lenin returned to Russia in November. The empire he found bore no resemblance to the one he'd left. Soviets governed Petersburg. Armed workers patrolled Moscow streets. The Tsar's October Manifesto had promised a constitution creating space for open political activity. But Lenin saw what others. The revolution was already being. The Tsar's concessions had split the opposition. Liberals, satisfied with promises of parliament, abandoned the fest. The army remained mostly loyal. December's Moscow uprising, which Bolsheviks supported, was crushed by it. By year's end, reaction was set. The 1905 revolution failed, but it taught invaluable lessons. Soviets showed how workers could organize themselves. The peasant uprising revealed rural revolutionary potential. The liberal betrayal confirmed that workers could rely only on themselves. Most importantly, the revolution had been a dress rehearsal. Next time, they'd know their parts better. Lenin escaped to Finland. The Tsarists mounted, spending 1906 in Odessa outside Petersburg. Clothes in auto smell gunpowder, but far enough to avoid police. He wrote obsessively, analyzing every aspect of the revolution, preparing for its next. The party remained split, weaker than before the revolution it had led to lead. But failure, properly studied, could be the best eco. The split at the Second Congress had seemed like disaster. Now Lenin realized it had been a united party would have meant endless compromise, fatal hesitation at crucial moments. Better to have a small, disciplined force that could act decisively when his story afforded another chance. The Menshevik school to have the moral high ground. Lenin would take power. 1905 had shown that Russian workers and peasants were ready for revolution. It had also shown that spontaneous uprising wasn't enough. Someone had to provide strategy, coordination, the will to push forward when others retreated. That Semayan would be Lenin's Bolsheviks, hardened by defeat, preparing for victory. The dress rehearsal was over. Time to prepare for the real performance. Chapter 10. The Wait After Defeat. The Glimmer over. The years after 1905 crushed Russian revolutionaries, a millstone grinding grain. Prime Minister's Dubin's necktie. The gallows worked overtime. 3,000 executed. Tens after thousands exiled to Siberia. Hundreds after thousands imprisoned. The Soviets were dissolved. The unions banned. Their revolutionary parties driven back underground. Hope itself became a contraband. Lenin retreated deeper into Finland, then back to Western Europe, when even Finland became unsafe. The Bolshevik organization he'd built with such care began disintegrating. Members fled abroad, were arrested, or simply gave up. Treasury funds evaporated. The party that would one day rule the largest country on earth couldn't afford to rent a decent meeting hall in Geneva. Worse than poverty was the poisonous atmosphere among exiles. Russian revolutionists, crammed into the same Swiss and French cities, nursing grudges in cheap cafes, fighting over ideological nuances. While the Tsar's regime stable, every faction published its sound newspaper, each claiming to represent true social democracy. The energy that should have gone into revolution dissipated in what Lenin bitterly called émigré squabbles, sloy, the Mensheviks, advocated liquidating the underground party and working legally in wait-for spaces. The regime permitted trade unions, cooperatives. The castrated parliament, called the Duma, Lenin raged against Slizmation, but faced his own. Should Bolsheviks participate in the Duma elections, use legal organizations, the old formulas from what is to be done? I didn't answer. Money became party dues from Russia dried. UP's organizations collapsed. Lenin served on his mother's diminishing sport and meager fees from articles. Then came the expropriation. Bolshevik fighting squads in the Caucasus, led by a young Georgian called Koba. Later Stalin robbed banks to fund the party. The Tiflis heist of 1907 netted hundreds of thousands of rubles, but also a storm of condemnation. Mensheviks denounced the robberies as criminality masquerading as revolution. European socialists were appalled. This wasn't how civilized Marxists behaved. Even some Bolsheviks question whether bank robbery advanced cause. Lenin defended the expropriations publicly, while privately worrying about their corrupting effects. Revolution required money, but at what? Personal life offered little comfort. Truth began publishing legally in Petersburg, circumventing censorship, careful language, while spreading Bolshevik ideas. Circulation grew to 40,000, reaching factories across theme. He was deep in theoretical work. During the war years, particularly 1916, while in Zurich, he would read at Mariam, the highest stage of capitalism, explaining how colonial superprofits allowed capitalists to bribe labor aristocracies with reforms, thus postponing European revolution. But imperialism also created new wars between capitalist powers, revolutionary movements. The chain would break at its wexling. By summer 1914, Lenin felt cautiously optimistic. The Bolsheviks had 6 deputies in the Duma, dozens of agents in major factories, a legal newspaper reaching thousands daily. The European socialist movement seemed. Millions of members pledged to prevent war through general strikes. History was moving again, slowly but perceptibly. Then came August. Archduke Ferdinand's assassination triggered declarations of war across Europe. Some socialist parties that had pledged international solidarity voted for war credits, sent workers to die for their national capitalists. The Second International collapsed overnight. Everything Lenin thought he knew about European socialism proved false. He was in Galicia when war broke out, nearly arrested as a Russian spy before socialist contacts vouched for him. Thejani to neutral Switzerland was a week-long train trip through a European mad with patriotic fever. Arriving in Bern, he found the exile community. Some socialists supported their governments. Others maintained pacifist opposition. Lenin developed a third position, revolutionary defeatism, turn imperialist war into civil. It was his loneliest hour. Even Bolsheviks found his position. Advocate defeat of your own government during. Use the crisis for revolution regardless of consequences. Pleno felt him insane. Emter labeled him a German agent. European socialist world even publish his. But Lenin had learned to trust this analysis over popular opinion. Imperialism made war inevitable. War created revolutionary. Those who compromised with patriotism betrayed socialism. Better toasted, alone with correct principles, than joined the social chauvinist chorus. History would vindicate him or make his. In a Zurich library, while millions died in trenches, Lenin studied Hegel's dialectics, preparing for opportunities he couldn't yet see. The European socialist movement lay in. The Bolshevik organization barreled. He was 45 years old, exhausted, isolated, leading a party that existed mostly in his own stubborn faith. But somewhere in the carnage, new possibilities were stirring. The old world was dying. Perhaps, just perhaps, a new one could be born. Chapter 11. The Guns of August. The Collapse of August 4th, 1914. Lenin sat in a Peronin cafe reading the new Frey press with growing disbelief. The German Social Democrats, 4 million strong theoretical layers of Marx and Engels, had voted unanimously for war credits. French socialists did the same. British Labour fell in line. The Second International Monument to Working-Class Saladi collapsed like a house built in sand. His first reaction was denial. The newspaper must be lying, spreading bourgeois propaganda. Surely Kautsky, Thepup of Marxism, hadn't blessed workers, killing workers for imperial glory. But confirmation arrived with each post. Socialist leaders across Europe rapped themselves in national flags, explaining this war was different, defensive, justified. The betrayal was. Local police arrived at his. As a Russian subject in Austrian territory, he was technically an enemy alien. They searched his rooms, confusing his notes on agrarian statics for military codes. Online intervention by Austrian socialists who assured authorities this strange Russian spent his time attacking. Not serving him saved Lenin from a longer imprisonment, though he was arrested and jailed for a period in August. The journey to Switzerland was a week-long train trip through a Europe transferred. Train stations swarmed with soldiers, heading to fronts that didn't exist yet. Citizens who'd been internationalists last month now howled for enemy blood. In Vienna, Lenin stopped to thank Austrian socialist Victor Adler for his help. Reaching Bern, he found the exilic community in chaos. Some Russian social democrats supported the Onant, arguing German military. Others backed the Central Powers, claiming Russian autocracy, the socialism's main enemy. Most retreated into pacifism, mouthing platitude about peace while workers died by thousands daily. Lenin found opposition. He developed his own analysis with characteristics. The war wasn't an accidental diplomatic failure, but imperialist logistical outcome. Capitalist powers had divided the world. Now they fought toward it. Socialist leaders who supported their governments were social covists, traitors who'd exchanged principles for ministerial portfolios and The correct position was revolutionary defeatism. Workers shoulder sire their own government's defeat, use the crisis to overthrow their ambiguïty, turn imperialist war into civil war. When MTO protested this mean millions more deaths, Lenin replied coldly, "The question is not how many die, but for what they die. Better civil war for socialism than imperialist war for capital." His fury focused on Karl Kautsky, once his theoretical guide. Kautsky's sophisticated justifications for German social democracy's betrayal. The need to defend culture against Tsarist. The tactical necessity of temperecum predepatriotism enraged Lenin more than crude patriotism. Here was Marxism prostituted twisted to justify Cordus. He wrote frantically thatatum articles that Swiss publishers forced to print. The collapse of the Nation dissected each socialist party's betrayal with French socialists had forgotten the Commune. Germans had traded Marx for the Kaiser. The interedifice of European socialism built over decades had crumbled at capital's first. But collapse created opportunity. If the old international was dead, a new one could be born. Smaller, harder, purged of opportunist infection. not a debating society, but a general staffer world revolution. The war had torn away democratic illusions, revealed capitalism's barbaric essence. No workers would learn through blood what propaganda. Inessa Armo joined him in Switzerland, helping organize what remained of the Bolshevik immigration. Together they planned a conference, anti-war socialists, reaching out to every group that hadn't succumbed to a patriotic fever. The responses were meager. A handful of Germans, some Italian youth, scattered individuals from neutral countries. But Lenin had learned that history rewards Menerish hold correct as it. Money was desperately short. His mother had died in 1916, cutting off family support. Party funds from Russia barely trickled through wartime borders. Lenin and Kripskaya moved to cheaper lodgings, ate in workers' cafeterias, darned clothes until they fell apart. The future ruler of Russia owned 2 suits, both shiny with, yet poverty sharpened his focus. While other exiles despaired, Lenin studied the war's economic impact, military technology. Every development confirmed his analyses. Imperialism was capitalist's final stage, pregnant with its own destruction. The question was whether revolutionists would serve as midwives or let the opportunity miscarry. Personal relationships strained under Rexel's pressure. Krupkaya's. Her relationship with Lenin had evolved into comradeship without warmth, revolutionary partnership without personal intimacy. She knew about Inessa, said nothing, continued managing his correspondence and manuscripts with meticulous care. Inessa herself struggled with their impossible situation. Lenin needed Hera's translator, organizer, perhaps the only person who could make him laugh, but he would never leave group's gear, never place personal happiness avo revolutionary duty. Inessa accepted these limits while slowly breaking inside. Revolution demanded everything, gave little back. By 1915, the war had settled into millions died for gains measured in meters. The same workers would marched to war singing now rotted in trenches, learning Lenin's lessons about imperialism through poison gas and machine guns. But would this education translate into revolutionariness? He placed his hopes on Russia, imperialism's weakest link. The Tsarist military machine, impressive on parade grounds, was crumbling under modern wars. Defeats mounted, casualty soared, food shortages spread from cities to countryside. Each disaster weakened autocracies, fountains created cracks through which revolution might. Reports from Bolsheviks inside Russia were fragmentary. The party organization, shattered by arrests and infiltration, was slowly rebuilding. Workers who'd supported the war initially now struck against munitions. Soldiers grumbled about incompetent officers and even peasants, normal liminarist, questioned a czar who couldn't. Lenin adjusted his tactics to wartime conditions. The old slogan democratic dictatorship of proletariat and peasantry no longer sufficed. He developed new formulations, defeat into revolution, imperialist war into civil war, Russian Revolution, a spark for European conflagration. Each phrase was calibrated to transform despair into action. Yet doubt crept in during sleepless nights. He was 46, exhausted by decades of struggle. His theoretical victories meant nothing if they remained theoretical. Would Hedi in Swiss exile, Anatha revolutionary fossil preserved in Central European amber. Sometimes he envied his brother's clarity. Better toady young for something than grow old, believing in a thing. The war ground on through 1916. Each month brought new horrors. Vidwana, the Somme Brusilov's offensive. Each battle confirmed imperialize Mishbanki while seeming to strengthen its grip. Lenin wrote, organized, waited, but history moved at its own pace. Revolution required objective conditions and subjective areas. The conditions were ripening, but where were the revolutionaries? Even as he acknowledged the gravel stillness in Europe, he saw Russia's revolution as on the march. He couldn't know that in Petersburg, renamed Petrograd in patriotic fever, women textile workers were planning a strike for International Women's Day, that bread shortages would bring them into streets, that their march would trigger mutinies, topple a dynasty, open possibilities beyond his wildest calculations. The future was preparing surprises while Lenin sat in Zurich, theorizing about a revolution he feared he'd never see. Chapter 12. Zimmerwald's Cry. September 5, 1915. Socialists gathered in A's village, chosen for its isolation. They arrived separately, pretending Tobe tourists, carrying rucksacks. Instead of revolutionary manifestos, the entire anti-war socialist movement, if Europe, fit in for carriages. Lenin joked bitterly that Internationaliscal now hold its meetings in a but small numbers meant clarity of purpose. Here were the ones who hadn't bent. Italian youth who'd split from their patriotic party. Germans risking prison for anti-war agitation. Poles and Serbs who refused to choose between compete. They looked exhausted, undernourished, prematurely aged, beswimming against history's current. Lenin saw future. The conference split a meet. The majority wanted a pacifist manifesto. Stop the war, restore international brotherhood, return to pre-war socialism. Lenin's faction demanded more. Turn imperialist war into civil war. Split from social covists permanently. Build new revolutionary international. Fedgments raged through Alpine nights while Europe peopled. Trotsky attended, still trying to reconcile irreconcilable positions. He crafted compromise language that satisfied no one completely but allowed common action. The Zimmerwald Manifesto condemned the war without endorsing, called for peace without specifying how to achieve it. Lenin signed while privately calling it better weaken to nationism than none at all. The Zimmerwald left. Lenin's faction within a faction met separately. A small group of delegates, the embryo of future Communist International. They drafted their own statement. Clear as mountain water, no peace with capitalism, no unity with traitors, no retreat from revolutionary principles. History would judge who was correct. Returning to Zurich, Lenin threw himself into theoretical work. If revolution was coming, it needed scientific guidance. He devoured books on economics, philosophy, military science. His notebooks filled with excerpts from Clausewitz on war, Hegel and dialectics, statistics on colonial exploitation. Each fact was ammunition for battle's head. Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, emerged from this study in 1916. Lenin's synthesis. Capitalism's final stage meant monopoly, finance, capital, colonial division, inevitable war. No forms could fix it. Revolution wasn't idealistic, dreaming, but historic. The book explained why European workers hadn't revolted as Marx predicted. Colonial super-profits allowed capitalists to bribe laboristocracies with crumbs from imperial feasts. But this solution created new colonial revolts, inter-imperial wars, revolutionary chance in weakest links. Capitalist postponed its crisis by daily life in Zurich settled into monastic routine. Morning study in Celebrate. Afternoon correspondence with evening meetings with whoever hadn't given up. Lenin lived like a graduate student. Shabby clothes, cheap lodgings, meals of bread and tea. The future chairman of the world's first socialist state owned nothing but books and conviction. Krupskaya managed their poverty with grim efficiency. She pawned her last jewelry, mended clothes until thread wouldn't hold, cooked meals from scraps. Her health deteriorated, thyroid disease advancing, heart weakening, but she never complained. Revolution had consumed her youth, middle-age health. She had nothing left to give, but Inessa lived near. She translated Lenin's articles, organized women's socialists, and was a trusted confidant. Sometimes the three would walk together, Lenin explaining theoretic points, Krupskaya Takina, Inessa adding insights. Observer saw news from Russia. The Bolshevik Duma deputies, arrested for anti-war agitation, were tried and exiled. Pravda were suppressed, reappeared under new names, suppressed again. Party organizations of through cellular structure Lenin had designed, but barely. Each Polish raid, each arrest, each betrayal weakened networks built over the. Yet reports also brought hope. Strike statistics climbed despite water mirror. Soldiers' letters spoke of growing hatred for officers who spent lives like cook. Food shortages in cities created explosive and workers with nothing to. Weapons from munitions factories. Consciousness sharpened by suffering. The objective conditions. Lenin analysis. The anti-war socialist movement continued to meet, but divisions persisted. New delegators, wantabistus, parliamentary action, gradual pressure for peace. Lenin's revolutionary position remained minoritarian. Even among minorities, he fought every compromise with exhausting intensity. When moderates proposed appealing to belligerent governments, Lenin erupted. Might as well petition wolves to become. When pacifists preached abstract humanity, he countered with peace without revolution, mere preparation for next war. Only proletarian power could end imperialism. The debates revealed fundamental divisions about socialism. For most delegates, it meant better wages, democratic rights, gradual. For Lenin, it meant dictatorship of proletariat, expropriation of expropriators, worldwide revolution. Thegop couldn't be bridged by cleverest. Two souls inhabit socialism's body, and divorce wasn't. Back in Zurich, he prepared for a split by building networks. Young Swiss socialists, radicalized by war, gathered around him. Fritz Platten, while would later play a role in his return to Russia, was among those influenced by Lenin's ideas. He taught like he wrote, sharp, clear, merciless toward confusion. Students emerged, either converted or repelled. By winter 1916, exhaustion was visible. Lenin's hair had thinned to wisps, his suturing on a frame worn down by decades. Irregular meals and constant tension. Headaches confined him to darkened rooms for days. At 46, he looked 60. Moved like an old man sustained only by will and caffeine. In January 1917, speaking to Swiss workers, he acknowledged that the older generation might not see the decisive battles of a coming European revolution, even as he affirmed that Europe was pregnant with it. He saw the Russian Revolution, however, as Wehrmacht on the march. 6 weeks later, revolution exploded. Women, textile workers dinting. Bread triggered events that upheld a 300-year dynasty in 8 days. History apparently hadn't read Lenin's. While he theorized in Zurich, Russian masses made revolution without a mission, creating possibilities bend any exile's imagination. The news arrived, garbled, incredible. Thesser abdicated, Soviets reborn, Provisionalgewand proclaiming democracy. Lenin paced his tiny apartment like a cat, desperate for reliable Everything he'd worked for was happening without him. 4,000 came away, behind enemy lines. Revolution had come, but how to reach it? He began planning immediately. Legal routes were impossible. No ally government would transport a revolutionary defeatist. But where legal channels failed, perhaps illegal ones might succeed. The German General Staff, eager to weaken Russia, might facilitate passage for exiles who preached revolution. It meant dealing with devils. But Lenin had learned that a story cared nothing for Chapter 13, The Sealed Train to Destiny. March 15, 19. Lenin burst into the library where a Kruske was reading, waving the Swiss newspaper. "It's happened," he shouted, disturbing Shelley silence. "The Tsar has abdicated." Other readers glared. But Lenin didn't care. Revolution had come to Russia while he sat in Zurich, marooned by geography and war. The first reports were fragmentary, contradictory. Women's protests had triggered military mutinies. The Duma had formed a provisional government. Soviets were organizing in factories. The Tsar was arrested or fled or dead. Nobody knew. But one fact emerged. 3 centuries of Romanov had ended in less than a week. History had accelerated. Beyond theory's ability to follow, Lenin's mind raced through. A bourgeois government world seeks stability, continue the war, postpone social revolution. The Soviets, if dominated by Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, would support this democratic stage. His Bolsheviks, leaderless and confused, might be swept along by patriotic euphoria. Every day remained in Switzerland. Meant opportunities lost, mistakes and he fired off telegrams to no compromise with Provisionalgewand, no support for armed the workers, all power to survive. But did they arrive? Were they heat? Communication through wartime borders was like shouting into a storm. He needed to return immediately. Butho. Every route seemed blocked by armies, borders, hostile, desperate schemes. Forge Swedish passports. Turiski, his face was known to police across Europe. Fly over Germany in aeroplane. Technically impossible and suicidal. Hide in a freight car. Thegeny would take weeks, if each plan collapsed under practical examination while precious time hemorrhaged. Then came the devil's bargain. Swiss socialists, including Fritz Blatten, acted as intermediaries with German authorities. The German Generalstaff, fighting a two-front war, desperately wanted Russian neutralized. Revolutionary exiles breaching defeatism might accomplish what German armies couldn't. Would Lenin accept German assistance to reach? The moral implications were staggering. Accepting German help meant providing Gemünchen to enemies who'd call him agent, forever. It meant collaborating with imperialists he'd spent years denouncing. It meant choosing revolutionary necessity over revolutionary purity. Lenin didn't. The question is not who you swim, he told wavering comrades. The question is reaching Russia before their revulsion is strangled. Negotiations proceeded through. The Germans agreed to transport a sealed train through that. No inspections, no contact with German authorities, extraterritorial status like a moving embassy. In return, the exiles would, it was understood by the Germans, contribute to Russia's instability and desire for peace, Each side thought it was using theater. History would judge who used Weaponry. The exile community explode in controversy. Mov denounced its plan as treason. Plechonov called Lenin a German spy. Even some Bolsheviks. How could they explain intercepting enemy assistance? Lenin responded with typical brutality. I would make a deal with the devil himself. It would help the revolution. Those who prefer clean hands to revolutionary should join a monastery, not a pot. On April 9, 1917, about 30 exiles, including Lenin, Kubskaya, and Anessa Armand, gathered at Zurich. They carried minimal luggage, maximum hope. Lenin had spent the previous night destroying papers, settling accounts, preparing for a journey from which he might not return. Revolution meant burning bridges, cementing. The train was indeed sealed. Chalk lines on the floor marked boundaries no one could cross. German guards rode in separate compartments, forbidden to interact with passengers. The exiles organized themselves with Soviet precision. Smoking restricted tough vestibule, toilet use by schedule, political discussions after meals. Eventually to revolution, Lenin insisted on discipline. Through Germany, they rolled across a landscape devastated by war, empty fields, destroyed villages, military trains heading to slaughter. Lenin barely looked out windows, having drafted key ideas for his April thesis before departure. His fellow passengers sexted him to support the provisional government temporarily, as orthodox Marxism demanded. They didn't know he was preparing to dynamite it. At night, unable to sleep, he paced the narrow corridor, mind churning through scenarios. What if the provisional government had consolidated? What if Bolsheviks had merged with men? What if the Soviets were already tamed? 3 years of war had changed Russia profoundly. His analysis might be obsolete. His party evaporated. They reached the Baltic coast at Sassnitz, transferred to Swedish ferry. The sealed train had served its purpose, delivering revelation through enemy territory without political contamination. Now Kimeskandana, neutral but nervous, watching the Russian chaos with anxiety. Swedish socialists met them, provided food and shelter, wondered if these Ebby Russians really intended to overthrow. Through Sweden, by train, crowds of curious workers gathering at stations. Lenin gave brief speeches. Revolution in Russia was pelagged to revolution everywhere. Imperialism's chain was breaking. Prepare for your own moment. The sweaty Showthretis, alarmed by his rhetoric, hurried the group toward Finland. Glad to make them someone else. Finland, still technically Poland to Russia, but in here, Lenin felt the landscape grew familiar. Birch, forests, wooden villages, Orthodox church, domes. Russian voices replaced German. Even the train wheels seemed to chant, closer, closer to revolution, closer to destiny, closer to home. They reached the Finnish-Russian border. No impediments now. Their provisional government proclamants couldn't prevent political exiles from returning. As they crossed into Russia, someone began singing. Others joined, voice growing stronger as Mother Russia embraced her prodigal children. Lenin remained silent, calculating. The journey's last leg to Petrograd passed in mounting excitement at every station. Workers and soldiers gathered, hungry for news, for leadership, for someone to explain what the revolution meant. Lenin watched from his window. The masses were armed, organized, expectant, but expectant of democratic republic, socialist. The answer would determine everything. They approached Petrograd as night fell on April 3rd, old style. Lenin had been traveling for 8 days, awake for most of them, sustained by nervous energy and iron will. In hours he would face comrades who'd made revolution without him, would propose a program non-expected, would split his own party if necessary. The sealed train had delivered him to his... Now he had to cross it. Krupskaya watched him stare into darkness as Petrograd's life. 17 years of exile were ending. The boy from Simbirsk, who'd vowed to find another way than his brother's noose had founded or thought he had. Revolution was no longer theory, but fact. No longer future, but present. Everything prepared for was about to be. As the train slowed for Finland's station, Vladimir Ulyanov ceased to exist. Lenin was coming home. Chapter 14. Riding View. Finland Station. April 3rd, 1917. 11:10 at night. Lenin stepped onto the platform into a scene from fever dreams. Searchlights blazed. Red banners fluttered. Thousands of workers, soldiers, sailors packed the square outside, singing revolutionary songs inside the station. Dignitaries from Theptrod Soviet waited with official greetings, prepared speeches about democratic unity, revolutionary diffidence, the long road ahead. They never got to deliver them. Lenin, ignoring the bouquet thrust at them, climbed onto an armored car and delivered his own message. Their provisional government was Borgesception. The imperialist war must end immediately. Land to the peasants, factories to workers, all power to the Soviets. Not someday, not after Putin preparation, but now. The crowd roared approval, while Soviet leaders stewed at Bolshevik headquarters in Thchasin Sky Mansion, a Belarina space-turned revolutionary fortress. Lenin repeated his program to Putin. They listened in mounting. Support the provision. Never unite with MENCHEVIKS. Betrayal. Continue the war defensively. Everything they'd agreed while he was gone, he had demolished in 10 minutes of articularity. Kamv, who'd led the party in Lenin's absence, tried to argue Russia wasn't ready for socialist revolution. The bourgeois hadn't completed its historical tasks. Workers were aiming. Peasants wanted only land, not so. Marx himself had written. Lenin cut him off. Marx wrote 40 front conditions. We have Soviets, dual power, armored masses. History offers a chance that won't repeat. Seize it or perish. The next day, Lenin presented his April thesis to a gathering of social. The reaction was explosive. Plechonov called them ravings of a man. Former allies accused him of fanaticism, blanquism, betraying Marxism itself. Even Pravda, the Bolshevik newspaper, published them with editorial disc. Lenin stood alone, as he heard so often, waiting for others to catch up. But in factories and barracks, workers and soldiers read theticizers differently. Here was Sumyan saying what they felt. The February Revolution was unfinished. Their provisional government protected landlords and capitalists. The war enriched proletariats, while common people did. Simple slogans crystallized Campbell feelings. Peace, land, bread, all power to the Soviets. Clear, concrete, uncompromising. Within weeks, Lenin had won over the Bolshevik party through meeting after meeting. He hammered his points home. The bourgeois revolution was complete. Now, come proletarian revolution. Soviets were embryonic workers' state. Dual power couldn't last. Either Soviets would triumph, or reaction would crush them. Nomadel. Events accelerated his. The provisional government trying to satisfy satisfied no one. Minister Ofrakinsky, yes, the son of Lenin's old gymnasium. Director launched a new offensive that collapsed in blood, and soldiers deserted en masse. Workers struck against factories still producing for war. Peasants seize a desk. July brought crisis. Soldiers from the Kronstadt naval base. Sailor sand workers staged armed demonstrations denied Soviet power. The Bolshevik Shaitan organized it. Lenin thought it premature, but couldn't abandon masses in motion. They tried directing their flood, while knowing it would ebb. After 3 days of chaos, government forces restored order. Now camera oppression. Lenin is a German agent, screamed headlines, publishing documents. Some forged, some real, a booth-sealed train. Warrants were issued for Bolshevik leaders. Red Guards, wearied as. The Sky Mansion was stormed. Lenin, after fierce internal debate, went into hiding. Better to live underground than die. USELESSLY. Revolution needed living leaders, not martyrs. He spent August and September in various hideouts. A worker's apartment in Petrograd, a haloft in Razliv, finally a flat in Helsinki. Disguised with a wig and clean-shaven for the only time in his adult life, he looked like a Finnish peasant, but his pen remained sharp. He worked on State and Revolution, a book based on reading done before the revolution, which outlined the future socialist state with chilling precision and wood. Published in 1918, from underground, he bombarded the Central Committee with increasingly antic letters. Kinsk's government was disintegrating. General Kornilov had attempted a military coup, defeated only because Bolsheviks organized workers' resistance. The masses were radical. Soviets in major cities had Bolshevik majority. History's moment had arrived. Strike now or lose everything. But the Central Committee hesitated. Kamv and Zainav argued for patience. Let the Constituent Assembly meet, gain power legally. Others worried about isolation, premature action, insufficient support. Lenin's letters. History will not forgive a revolutionist who could win today but risk losing tomorrow. Delay is death. October 10th. Lenin returned to Petrograd secretly for a Central Committee meeting, a apartment belonging to Sukhanov, a Menshevik whose wife was secretly Bolsheviki. 12 leaders debated while Lenin, still wigged and beardless, pounded the. The vote was 10-2 for insurrection. Kamv and Zinva opposing would soon publicly reveal the decision. The insurrection was planned for October 25th, when the Second Congress of Soviets would meet. Not a coup, but a transfer of power from discredited government to legitimate Soviet authority. Trotsky, now Bolshevik, heading the military revolutionary Kate, organized brilliantly. Key points were identified. Bridges, telegraph stations, power plants, Red Guards were armed and on the night of October 24th, Lenin could wait no longer. Against Central Committee orders, he left his hiding place and walked through darkened streets to Small Institute, Soviet headquarters. Challenged by patrols, he claimed to be a. Reaching Small, he found organized chaos, messengers racing, telephones ringing, but action progressing too slowly for his taste. "You are procrastinating," he roared at startled commanders. Through into palace, where ministers huddled, should be every moment's delay gave reaction time to organize. By dawn on the 25th, most strategic points were secured with minimal bloodshed. Kinskefeld, in a borrowed car. Other ministers waited arrest in the Winter Palace, defended by cadets and a women's battalion. That evening, as the palace fell to a shambolic assault more comic than heroic, Lenin addressed the Soviet Congress. "We shall now proceed to construct the socialist order," he announced, as if discussing tomorrow's weather. Mensheviks and right socialist revolutionaries walked out in protest. Trotsky sent them to history's dustbin. Power had passed to the Soviets, meaning to the Bolsheviks, who controlled. The first decrees revealed Lenin's tactical genius. The decree on peace proposed immediate negotiations, appealing over governments' heads to war exhort. The decree on land gave peasants what they'd already taken, legitimizing seizures while establishing Soviet authority. Simple popular measures that consolidated support were Lenin's organized resistance. Within weeks, challenges. State employees struck. Banks refused funds. The constituents elected before October had an anti-Bolshevik majority. Officers were forming white armies. Foreign powers prepared intervention. Every Marxist text said socialist revolution required developed capitalism which Russia lacked. Reality mocked theory daily. Lenin adapted with brutal flexibility. The Constituent Assembly-wise dispersed after one day. Revolutionary dictatorship is power won by force and unrestricted by any laws. Banks were occupied. Striking bureaucrats were replaced by workers who learned administration how practice. When left socialist revolutionaries quit the government over peace terms, Bolsheviks ruled. By March 1918, when the government fled to Moscow, Germans advanced. Lenin had kept power for 5 months, longer than the Paris Commune, his only president. The Brest-Litovsk peace treaty cost huge territories, but bought time. Civil war was beginning, but Reds held the center while Whites remained scattered against all probability. The October gamble was being. Yet Lenin knew this was only the beginning. Russian Revolution without European Revolution meant socialism in a backward country. A contradiction Marx never imagined. Every temporary measure, terror, one-party rule, economic centralization risked becoming permanent. The whirlwind he'd ridden to power might destroy what it had created, but no retreat was possible now. History, Wold, Judge Assaults. Chapter 15. Beyond the textbook and the Civil War years turned Lenin from revolutionary into ruler, theorist into practitioner of power from his Kremlin office. He directed simultaneous battles against enemies. For interventions, peasant rebellions, economic collapse, and the stubborn refusal of European workers to follow Russia's example. Each crisis demanded additions no Marxist text had anticipated. War communism emerged from desperation as doctrine. Grain requisitioning fed cities and armies while alienating peasants. Industry was nationalized, not from socialist principle, but because owners fled or sabotaged production. Money became worthless paper. Distribution replaced market. Lenin justified each measure as revolutionary necessity, while privately knowing they were The Cheka political police led by Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky evolved from defending revolution to devouring suspected enemies. "We aren't waging war against individuals," Dzerzhinsky explained. "We're exterminating the bourgeois as a class." The logic was impeccable. The result horrifying. Each white atrocity justified red. Each red excess provoked wit. Violence spiraled by and Lenin authorized executions with the same precision he'd analyzed statistics. When Fanny Kaplan, a socialist revolutionary, shot him in August 1918, leaving bullets that would slowly poison him, He refused personal revenge, but approved systematic retaliation. Hundreds of class NMS'd for one woman's act. Revolutionary marchum counted lives differentlython. Bourgeois morality, yet he could still surprise with flashy soft, the old theoretical subtlety. When communist parties formed across Europe, Lenin wrote, "Left-wing communism, an infantile disorder" in 1920, warning against revolution, boycotting, expecting instant revolution. These were children's games. Real politics meant maneuvering, retreating, exploiting every legal possibility while building By 1920, the whites were at foreign interventions had failed, but victory's price was industry produced 17th of 1913 levels. Cities emptied as workers fold to villages seeking food. The proletariat, in whose name Bolsheviks ruled hard, nearly disappeared. Peasants having Zai's land wanted nothing from communists but to be left. Then came Kronstadt. The same sailors who'd been Bolshevism's vanguard belt in March 1901, demanding free Soviets, end to Bolshevik monopoly, restoration of revolutionary democracy. Lenin or Deradiso across the ice, personalis erecting reliable troops. Thousand seed attacking former comrades. Afterward, he looked aged beyond his 50 years. "We've gone too far," he admitted privately, announcing the new economic policy at the 10th Party Congress. NEP restored limited capitalism. Peasants scowled trade freely. Small business separate privately. Foreign concessions were welcomed. Party deeds. Lenin replied that Semetima's retreat enabled future advance. Socialism couldn't be built through will. But even while retreating draconically, he tightened the same Congress that approved NEP, banned factions within the party. Democracy already strangled in society within Bolshevism itself. The logic was familiar. Temporary measures, yet each temporary measure seemed to become permanent. Each exception evolved into. His health deteriorated through 1921. Headaches became blinding. Insomnia alternated with exhaustion. Doctors prescribed rest. Lenin prescribed himself more work. There was so much to build. Electrification plans, educational campaigns, diplomatic. Soviet Russia had survived, but remained isolated, backward, vulnerable. Everything depended on his driving will. May 1922 brought the first stroke. His right side partially paralyzed, speech slurred. Recovery seemed possibly wantal. December's second stroke left him unable to write. The man who'd lived through words was trapped in. Secretaries took dictation, but thoughts that had flowed like water now came in pain. His last writings showed unexpected doubts. The bureaucracy he'd created to implement revolution was suffocating it. Stalin appointed General Secretary Tahando. Administrative tasks was accumulating dangerous power. The party rolled in workers' name, but workers had no voice. Revolution had succeeded, and power was won, but socialism remained distant. Testament dictated in December 1902 to warned against Stalin's rudeness, Trotsky's arrogance, the danger of splits. But who would heed warnings from a dying man? The struggle for succession was already beginning. Old Bolshevik followed Lenin through exile, and underground maneuvered for position while he lay paralyzed, watching his life's work mute. March 1903 brought the third stroke, stealing speech entirely. The voice that had commanded revolution was silenced. Heckled only gesture, his eyes showing either understanding or confusion. Visitors couldn't tell which. Krupskaya to him, pretending Sometimes he seemed toned. More often he stared at. Through spring and summer Helengard, neither improving nor quotidian. The party leadership visited dutifully, briefing him on developments couldn't influence. NEP was succeeding economically, but creating new party membership swelled with careerists. The Comintern, supposed to spread revolution, was becoming Soviet foreign policy tool. Everything was wrong, but nothing could be changed. His last months were spent at Gorky Estate outside Moscow, surrounded by doctors, guards, and crushing silence. The man who'd given his life to history was removed from it, watching through windows as Caesar. Did he think of Simberg, of his brother's noose, of Swiss exile, of October's triumph? No one knows. His touts died with him. January 21, 1924, 6:50 in the evening. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin, stopped. He was 53 years old, had ruled for 6 years, changed the world forever. The brain that autopsy revealed showed massive damage. Revolution had literally burned out his circuits. He'd driven himself like a machine until they embalmed him against his wishes, built a mausoleum he would have hated, turned the fierce iconoclast in. Stalin spoke at the funeral, pledging to guard Lenin's legacy while preparing to betray it. Trotsky, conveniently absent, would spend his remaining years claiming Lenin's mantle while missing Lenin's tactical genius. What remained was a transformed world. An empire had fallen, replaced by Smethengunprident, a state claiming to rule for workers, spreading revolution like a religion. Capitalism would never again sleep soundly. Colonial peoples had seen Europeans could be defeated. History's spiral had taken an but questions haunted Lenin's legacy. Could socialism be built in one backward country? Did revolutionary ends justify any means? Was the party's dictatorship temporary necessity or permanent defamation? He'd answered with actions, not theories, leaving others to rationalize results. The future would judge harshly, but couldn't ignore what he'd achieved or what achieving it had cost. In the end, he'd found another waif in his brother's noose, but perhaps not as different as he'd hoped. Violence just organized differently, death just distributed more widely. Thesum Saru's state, just with new, yet also something proof that history could jump track, that impossibilities could become inevitable overnight. The boy from Simbers had moved the world. Whether toward paradise or perdition remained an open question. Epilogue: the revolution. Roughly 67 years after Lenin's death, the Soviet Union collapsed like a ooze of rotten timber. No foreign invasion, no capitalist historian, just ex-house tune. As if the effort of maintaining his impossible dream had finally depleted all reserves. In August 1991, crowds toppled his statues across Eastern Europe, while historians debate what it had almoned. The easy verdict was failure. Socialist paradise had become workers' state had meant party international revolution had produced Russian Empire. Every promise had equality became hierarchy, freedom became abundance became a Critics proclaimed history's judgment final. Leninism was a dead end, a prophet's vision, Yet the echo persisted, refusing simple dismissal. In Chinese factories, Vietnamese villages, Cuban hospitals, Lenin's portrait still hung, not the embalmed corpse, but the living revolutionary who proved emperors could fall. His tactical writings, guided movements that had never heard after what is to be done. Organized unions in Sao Paulo, guerrillas in Chiapas, protesters in Seattle. More subtly, his ghost haunted the capitalist world that thought it had workers' rights, social welfare, anti-colonial movements, all bore fingerprints of the threat he'd represented. Capitalism reformed itself, partially to avoid the fate he'd. Even in failure, October's revolution had changed what was possible, thinkable. The man himself remained.